The August heat of 2024 had brought the Yellowstone River to its lowest level in decades. What nature revealed that morning would unravel a mystery that had haunted Montana for 31 years. A kayaker navigating the exposed rocks near hell-roaring rapids spotted something wedged between two boulders, an overturned aluminum canoe, its red paint faded but still visible. Inside, wrapped in military-grade waterproof bags, were two driver's licenses dated 1993. More remarkably, a cassette recorder, sealed in its protective case, still functioned after 3 decades underwater. Before we begin the story, write in the comments which city you're from. We're very interested to know where you're watching our video from. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your rating. The discovery sent shockwaves through the small rafting community of Gardner, Montana. Theodore Blackwood and Mason Rivers had vanished on July 15, 1993, during what should have been a routine inspection of the river routes. Their disappearance had become local legend, a cautionary tale told to new guides about respecting the river's power. But the cassette recorder would reveal that the river wasn't the only danger that day. Theodore Blackwood had been just 24 years old that summer of 1993, a rising star in the rafting world. His colleagues remembered him as innovative, always searching for safer routes through the treacherous rapids. Theo had this gift, a former co-worker recalled decades later. He could read the water like others read books. He'd spot dangers nobody else noticed. His personnel file, yellowed with age, showed commendations for safety innovations and customer service. He'd been with Mountain Waters Rafting Company for 3 seasons, promoted twice. Mason Rivers, 26, brought military precision to the rafting operation. Though he'd washed out of Navy SEAL training due to a knee injury, he retained the discipline and attention to detail. His logbooks, discovered in storage after the canoe's recovery, showed meticulous records of every trip, every equipment check, every weather pattern. Mason was the one you wanted on difficult runs, remembered a veteran guide. Cool under pressure, never rattled. His background check from 1993 showed an exemplary service record, medical discharge with honors, and glowing recommendations from his commanding officers. The third member of that fateful expedition had been Felix Raven, then 23, the youngest and newest addition to the guide team. Unlike the victims, Felix had survived that day, returning to shore with a harrowing tale of sudden storms and equipment failure. His testimony had shaped the narrative for 3 decades. The weather turned without warning, he'd told investigators in 1993. One moment, clear skies. The next, we were fighting walls of water. I tried to reach them, but the current... The young man's apparent trauma had been so convincing that he'd become something of a local hero, the survivor who'd nearly died trying to save his colleagues. But 3 days before that July afternoon, something had shifted in the dynamics at Mountain Waters Rafting Company. Theo had been working late in the equipment storage facility, cross-referencing inventory logs with purchase orders. His girlfriend would later tell investigators that he'd seemed troubled that week. He kept saying something didn't add up, she remembered. Equipment that should have been there wasn't, and gear that shouldn't exist was logged in the books. Theo had started keeping his own records, photocopying documents after hours. The morning of July 15, 1993, had dawned clear and calm. Weather records confirmed ideal conditions, light winds, no precipitation forecasted, perfect visibility. The 3 guides had loaded their gear into the company van at 6 a.m. Security wasn't what it would become. There were no cameras, no GPS trackers, just a handwritten log showing their planned route and expected return time of 6 p.m. They were conducting a routine safety inspection of the hell-roaring rapid section, preparing for the busy late summer season. Carter Sterling, the owner of Mountain Waters Rafting Company, had been in Denver that day, or so he'd claimed. The 45-year-old entrepreneur had built the company from nothing, starting with 2 rafts and a pickup truck in 1985. By 1993, he operated a fleet of 12 rafts and employed 15 guides. Carter ran a tight ship, former employees recalled, every penny accounted for, every trip documented. His absence on the day of the disappearance had seemed like unfortunate timing. He'd returned to find his 2 best guides missing and his newest employee traumatized. The insurance policies would only come to light weeks later. Sterling had taken out substantial life insurance policies on all his guides just 2 weeks before the incident, a detail he'd explained as standard business practice. Dangerous work requires protection, he'd told investigators. Their families deserve security if something happened. Each policy was worth $2 million, with the company as beneficiary to cover training replacement guides and potential lawsuits. Luna Morrison entered the picture as Theo's girlfriend, though that relationship would prove more complex than initially appeared. 28 years old in 1993, she worked as a waitress at the Wonderland Cafe, where the guides gathered after shifts. Luna and Theo seemed perfect together, witnesses recalled. Young, adventurous, talking about moving to Colorado, starting their own rafting company. She'd been working a double shift the day of the disappearance, with multiple witnesses confirming her presence at the cafe from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. But Luna's connection to Mason Rivers had remained hidden in 1993. Only when investigators reopened the case in 2024 did they discover love letters in Mason's storage unit, passionate correspondences dated just weeks before the disappearance. "I can't keep pretending," Luna had written. "Every time I'm with him, I think of you." Mason's response revealed the depth of their secret. "After the season ends, we'll tell him together. I owe Theo that much honesty." The timeline of July 15th had been reconstructed through various sources. At 11:45 a.m., the 3 guides made their last radio check-in from Gardner Bridge, reporting normal conditions and proceeding to the rapids. The radio log, maintained by the company dispatcher, showed clear communication with no concerns raised. "River's running smooth, heading to Section 3, Theo's voice had crackled over the radio. That would be the last anyone heard from them. Weather data told a precise story. At 2 p.m., conditions remained calm at the hell-roaring rapids section. The storm system Felix had described didn't arrive until 4 p.m., 2 hours after he claimed it had struck. This discrepancy had been overlooked in 1993. Weather tracking wasn't as precise, and investigators had assumed the mountains created microclimate variations. But modern meteorological analysis of archived data painted a clear picture. Felix's timeline was impossible. At 3:30 p.m., something remarkable had been documented but misunderstood. A park ranger at Tower Junction, 5 miles from hell-roaring rapids, had logged seeing a lone figure at the emergency river access point. The ranger noted the person appeared to be checking equipment, not distressed or seeking help. The entry read, 3:30 p.m., single rafter at emergency pullout, appears routine. The ranger couldn't identify the individual from that distance, but remembered the company van parked nearby. Felix's return at 7:30 p.m. had been dramatic. Witnesses described him as shaking, incoherent, claiming to have swum miles through raging waters after their raft flipped. Yet his clothes, while wet, showed no signs of the tears or damage that such a traumatic journey would have caused. Shock, the EMTs had concluded. People do remarkable things in crisis situations. His story of equipment failure and sudden weather had been accepted without question. The search efforts that followed had been extensive but fruitless. The river was dragged, helicopters searched the canyon, volunteer teams walked every accessible bank. The assumption was that the bodies had been swept into one of the deep pools or underground channels that honeycomb the river bottom. The Yellowstone doesn't always give back what it takes, search and rescue had concluded after 2 weeks. The case had gone cold, another tragedy in a dangerous profession. In the equipment logs that Theo had been investigating, a pattern emerged that wouldn't be understood until 2024. Safety gear was being systematically reported as damaged and replaced, but the damaged equipment was never documented as disposed of. Someone was stockpiling compromised gear while billing the company for new equipment. The scheme was clever, small enough to avoid notice in regular audits, but substantial over time. Theo's notes, found in his apartment after the disappearance, showed he'd identified over $30,000 in suspicious transactions. The cassette recorder recovered from the canoe contained 90 minutes of audio, though water damage had corrupted much of it. What remained was fragmentary but revealing. Theo's voice, young and confident, narrating their journey. July 15th, 11 a.m., water temperature 52 degrees, visibility excellent. Mason's military bearing came through even in casual conversation. Checking northeast approach, current running 3 knots faster than last week. But it was the final audible section that changed everything investigators thought they knew. The recording captured an argument, though only portions were clear. Theo's voice no longer confident, but confused. "Felix, what are you talking about? What program?" A response mostly static, then Mason, his military training evident in his tactical assessment. "He's got a knife. Theo, get to the—" The audio cut to static, but a final fragment emerged after extensive restoration. Felix's voice, calm and methodical. "You shouldn't have looked into the equipment. You shouldn't have asked about Panama." Panama. That single word would unlock everything. Mason's service record showed he'd been deployed to Panama in 1989 during Operation Just Cause. His unit had worked with DEA assets, identifying and capturing cartel members. The operation was classified, but certain details had emerged over the years, including the fact that several cartel members had been offered immunity and new identities in exchange for testifying against their leadership. The witness protection connection wouldn't be confirmed until investigators accessed sealed federal records in 2024. But the pieces were falling into place. A young man appears in Montana in 1992, no history before that date, claims to be from back east with vague references to family troubles. Gets hired at a rafting company where background checks were minimal. Keeps a low profile, but proves competent enough to earn trust. Everything about Felix Raven before 1992 was fabrication. The equipment storage facility where Theo had made his discovery sat on the outskirts of Gardner, a metal building that baked in summer and froze in winter. In 1993, it had no security cameras, just a padlock and a logbook. The night before the disappearance, the logbook showed an unusual entry. Felix had accessed the facility at 11 p.m., claiming to need gear for an early morning training session. But no training was scheduled for July 15th. He'd been there for 2 hours, alone with the equipment. The life jackets would become crucial evidence. When recovered with the canoe in 2024, forensic analysis revealed they'd been deliberately sabotaged. The CO2 cartridges had been punctured with a thin blade, allowing them to inflate initially, but leak rapidly. The cuts were precise, professional, hidden in the seams where regular inspection wouldn't notice. Someone with knowledge of the equipment had engineered their failure. The type of cut matched a specific kind of knife, a narrow filleting blade, common among river guides. Felix's behavior in the days following the disappearance had seemed appropriate for a traumatized survivor. He'd helped coordinate search efforts, comforted other employees, even spoke at a memorial service 2 weeks later. "They were the best of us," he'd said, tears streaming down his young face. "I'll carry the weight of surviving every day of my life." His performance had been flawless, a grieving colleague processing an unimaginable tragedy. But there had been one strange detail that witnesses remembered only when questioned in 2024. The day after the disappearance, Felix had received a phone call at the company office. The caller hadn't identified themselves, and the conversation had been brief. A coworker overheard only Felix's side. "Yes, it's done. No, nobody suspects. I need the rest of it now." When asked about the call, Felix had claimed it was his mother, concerned about news reports of the accident. The $50,000 that appeared in Felix's account the next day had been explained as an inheritance from a grandmother. The paperwork seemed legitimate: death certificate, will, transfer documents. But investigators in 2024 would discover that the grandmother had never existed. The death certificate was forged, the will fabricated. The money had come from a federal account used for witness protection payments. Someone had authorized an emergency relocation payment, but Felix had never relocated. As July 15th turned to evening in 1993, the last documented sighting of Theo and Mason alive came from an unexpected source. A Japanese tourist, photographing wildlife near hell-roaring rapids, had captured something in the background of his elk photos. The images, discovered in his photo album when he heard about the 2024 discovery, showed 3 figures by the river at approximately 2:30 p.m. 2 were seated on rocks, apparently resting. The third stood behind them, holding what appeared to be a long object. The photo quality wasn't sufficient for identification, but the timing and location matched perfectly. The investigation that began in August 2024 approached the cold case with technology and techniques unavailable 3 decades earlier. DNA analysis, digital reconstruction of degraded audio, satellite imagery archives, tools that would have seemed like science fiction in 1993. The lead investigator, a methodical detective who'd been in grade school when Theo and Mason disappeared, began by re-examining every piece of evidence through modern lens. The cassette recorder's recovered audio underwent extensive digital restoration at the FBI laboratory in Quantico. Technicians used artificial intelligence to separate voices from static, reconstructing conversations from fragments. What emerged painted a disturbing picture of the final hours. At 12:30 p.m., Theo could be heard discussing the equipment irregularities. "These serial numbers don't match. This gear was reported destroyed last month, but here it is." Mason's response was measured. "Document everything. We'll talk to Carter when he gets back from Denver." But it was Felix's voice that proved most revealing. Throughout the early portions of the recording, he'd remained largely silent, offering only brief acknowledgments. Then, at approximately 1:45 p.m., his tone changed. "You guys are making a big deal out of nothing. Maybe the paperwork's just wrong." When Theo disagreed, Felix's response carried an edge. "Sometimes it's better not to dig too deep. You never know what you might find." The threat had been subtle enough to miss in casual conversation, but chilling in hindsight. Carter Sterling's alibi for July 15, 1993, had seemed solid. Hotel records confirmed his check-in at the Denver Marriott on July 14th. He'd attended a tourism conference, multiple witnesses placing him at sessions throughout July 15th. But investigators in 2024 discovered something the original investigation missed. A gas station receipt from Livingston, Montana, time-stamped 4:47 a.m. on July 15th, paid with Carter Sterling's credit card. Livingston was 60 miles from Gardner, an hour's drive. He could have driven to Gardner and back to Denver by afternoon. When confronted with this evidence, Sterling, now 76 and running a successful chain of adventure tourism companies, had an explanation. "I let Felix use my card sometimes for company expenses. He must have filled up the van that morning." But company records showed the van had been fueled on July 14th with a full tank logged at shift end. The receipt was for a different vehicle, one never identified. The insurance policies Sterling had purchased proved even more intriguing. While he'd claimed they were standard for all employees, documentation showed only Theo and Mason had been covered by the $2 million policies. Other guides had basic coverage worth a fraction of that amount. More tellingly, the policies had been purchased just 2 weeks before the disappearance, immediately after Theo had begun investigating the equipment discrepancies. The timing seemed more than coincidental. Luna Morrison, now Luna Harrison after marrying in 1996, lived in Portland, Oregon. When investigators arrived at her door in September 2024, she seemed to have been expecting them for 31 years. "I knew this day would come," she said, inviting them in. Her apartment was modest but comfortable, filled with photographs of children and grandchildren. Notably absent were any pictures from her time in Gardner. Luna's story had evolved with age and perspective. Yes, she'd been involved with Mason Rivers. The attraction had been instant, overwhelming, impossible to resist. Theo was sweet, safe, the kind of man you should want, she explained. Mason was dangerous, passionate, the kind of man you couldn't help wanting. Their affair had begun in May 1993, conducted in secret during her break shifts and Mason's days off. They'd talked about running away together, starting fresh in California. But Luna revealed something she'd hidden in 1993. The morning of July 15th, Mason had called her at the cafe. He sounded strange, worried, said Theo had discovered something about Felix, something that didn't make sense. He mentioned Panama, asked if I knew anything about witness protection programs. I thought he was being paranoid. The call had lasted only 3 minutes, but Luna remembered Mason's final words. "If something happens, tell them to look into Felix's past." She'd never delivered that message. "I was terrified they'd discover our affair. I thought if I stayed quiet, it would all go away. Then, when Felix came back alone, traumatized, talking about the accident, I convinced myself Mason had been paranoid about nothing. The guilt had haunted her for decades, manifesting in failed marriages, therapy sessions, a life spent running from a truth she'd been too frightened to tell. Felix Raven had vanished from Gardner in late 1994, claiming the memories were too painful. He'd left no forwarding address, no contact information, simply disappeared as suddenly as he'd appeared. But federal employment records, accessed through a warrant in 2024, revealed he'd been hired by the U.S. Postal Service in Billings, Montana, under the same name. He'd worked there for 5 years before transferring to Seattle, then Portland, then seemingly evaporating in 2003. The hunt for Felix Raven revealed the sophistication of his hidden identity. Credit reports, tax records, employment history, all perfectly maintained until 2003, then nothing. It was as if he'd ceased to exist. This pattern was familiar to investigators who worked with witness protection cases. Someone had helped Felix disappear, providing him with yet another identity, another fresh start. But who had that kind of power, and why? The answer came from an unexpected source. A retired DEA agent named William Frost, living in Florida, saw news coverage of the Yellowstone discovery. He recognized something in the story, a pattern from his past. He called the Montana investigators with information that would crack the case wide open. "I worked Panama in '89. We flipped a cartel enforcer named Carlos Mendoza. Young kid, maybe 20, but he'd already killed 3 people that we knew of. Smart, ruthless, adaptable. We gave him a new identity and relocated him." Frost's records, maintained privately despite regulations, included a photograph of Carlos Mendoza, taken in 1989. Age progression software compared it to the few existing photos of Felix Raven from 1993. The match probability came back at 94%. Carlos Mendoza had become Felix Raven, placed in Montana with a fabricated history and monthly payments to maintain his cooperation. But the program had strict rules. Any criminal activity would void the agreement and result in immediate deportation to face cartel justice. The Witness Protection Program's records from 1993 revealed a troubling pattern. Felix's handler, Agent Marcus Webb, had noted concerns about his charge's activities. Subject appears to be engaged in unauthorized employment, possible criminal enterprise. Recommend immediate extraction. But the recommendation had been overruled by Webb's supervisor, who cited the value of Felix's ongoing testimony in upcoming trials. The supervisor's name was redacted, but their decision had allowed Felix to remain in place despite clear violations. Mason River's military background provided another piece of the puzzle. His service in Panama had included detention duty at a facility where captured cartel members were held. The roster of detainees included Carlos Mendoza. Mason would have seen his face, might even have interacted with him during interrogations. When Mason mentioned Panama on the recording, he wasn't making random connections. He was remembering where he'd seen Felix before. The equipment fraud scheme that Theo had discovered generated relatively small amounts of money, perhaps $5,000 monthly. But for someone receiving only basic witness protection stipends, it would have doubled Felix's income. The risk seemed manageable. Who would carefully audit a small rafting company's equipment logs? But Theo's meticulous nature and genuine concern for safety had led him to examine records nobody else bothered to check. Investigators reconstructed the fatal day through evidence and logic. Felix had learned about Theo's discoveries either through overhearing conversations or being confronted directly. He knew an investigation would expose not just the fraud, but his identity. The federal government would void his protection, and the cartel, still active despite arrests, would exact revenge for his betrayal. Carlos Mendoza would die painfully if his location became known. The sabotaged life jackets indicated premeditation. Felix had prepared for violence, choosing a method that would appear accidental. Swift water accidents claimed lives every year. 2 more victims would raise few questions. But he hadn't anticipated Mason recognizing him, hadn't expected the military-trained guide to piece together his identity from half-remembered faces and suspicious behavior. The confrontation by the river hadn't gone as planned. The park ranger who'd spotted someone at the emergency pullout at 3:30 p.m. had unknowingly witnessed the aftermath. Felix had likely killed both men by then, letting the river claim their bodies while he ensured no evidence remained. The sabotaged life jackets would fail. The swift current would scatter any remaining traces. He'd waited until the storm arrived at 4:00 p.m., then soaked himself in the river to support his story of survival. Bank records from 1993 showed Felix's $50,000 deposit came from an account linked to federal law enforcement operations. Someone had authorized an emergency payment, likely as hush money or relocation funds. But Felix had stayed in Gardner another year, maintaining his cover, playing the traumatized survivor. Only when attention faded did he quietly disappear, aided by someone with access to create new identities. The investigation turned to finding Felix's current identity. Facial recognition software compared the aged photo of Carlos Mendoza to driver's license databases across the country. In October 2024, they found a match: Richard Chase, age 55, living in Burlington, Vermont, working as a fishing guide on Lake Champlain. The irony wasn't lost on investigators. He'd returned to the water, guiding tourists through safer passages than the Yellowstone's rapids. Surveillance of Richard Chase began immediately. He lived alone in a modest cabin, maintained few relationships, exhibited the careful behavior of someone always watching over their shoulder. His neighbors knew him as quiet, helpful, but private, someone who'd arrived 5 years ago claiming to be escaping a bad divorce. He paid cash for everything, had no social media presence, existed on the margins of modern connected society. The arrest team assembled on October 15, 2024, exactly 31 years and 3 months after the murders. They surrounded the cabin at dawn, expecting resistance from a former cartel enforcer. But when they announced themselves, Richard Chase, Felix Raven, Carlos Mendoza, simply walked out with his hands raised. "I've been expecting you for 31 years, he said. His first question wasn't about lawyers or rights, but something else entirely. Are Mason's and Theo's families still alive? In custody, the man who'd lived 3 lives began talking. The paranoia of constant hiding, the weight of his crimes, the exhaustion of maintaining lies for decades. It all came pouring out. He confirmed what investigators had suspected. Yes, he'd killed them. No, it hadn't been planned initially. Yes, someone in the government had helped him disappear. The confession lasted 12 hours, recorded on video, a catalog of crimes spanning decades and identities. The motive, as investigators had theorized, was self-preservation layered with panic. When Theo had confronted him about the equipment fraud on July 14th, threatening to report it to Carter and the authorities, Felix had seen his carefully constructed world collapsing. The fraud itself was minor, but any investigation would reveal his false identity. The Witness Protection Program had one iron rule: stay clean or face deportation. The cartel had a simpler rule: betrayal meant death. I tried to convince them to let it go, Felix said in his confession. Told them I'd stop, pay everything back. But Theo was too honest, said it was about safety, about integrity. And Mason, when he mentioned Panama, when I saw recognition in his eyes, I knew he'd figured it out. He'd been there, seen my face in those detention centers. It was only a matter of time before he made the connection. The sabotaged life jackets had been Plan A, make it look like an accident, equipment failure in dangerous water. But the confrontation had escalated. Mason went for his knife when he realized what I was doing. Theo tried to run. I did what I'd been trained to do in my previous life: quick, efficient. He wouldn't provide graphic details, and investigators didn't push. They had enough for conviction without traumatizing the families further. The government connection proved more complex. Agent Marcus Webb had died in 2010, taking many secrets to his grave. But investigation revealed he'd been under surveillance by Internal Affairs for suspected corruption. He'd apparently been selling information to relocated witnesses, helping them disappear when their crimes caught up. Felix had been one of several who'd vanished with Webb's assistance, given new identities outside official channels. Carter Sterling's role remained ambiguous. The gas receipt suggested he'd known more than he'd admitted, but Felix insisted Sterling wasn't involved in the murders. He might have suspected the equipment fraud, maybe even tolerated it for a cut, but he didn't know about my past. Nobody did until Mason started putting pieces together. Sterling would never face charges. He'd died of natural causes in 2019. His tourism empire passed to his children. Luna Morrison Harrison arrived in Montana in November 2024 to provide additional testimony. She brought letters Mason had written her, hidden for 3 decades in a safety deposit box. One, dated July 13th, seemed prophetic. Something's off with the new guide, Felix. Can't shake the feeling I've seen him before, in a place that makes no sense. If my instincts are right, we could all be in danger. She'd dismissed it as military paranoia then. Now it read like a warning from beyond the grave. The families of Theo Blackwood and Mason Rivers had waited 31 years for answers. Theo's parents had passed away, but his sister Sarah, now 52, attended every day of the legal proceedings. "We always knew the river didn't take him," she said. "Theo was too good, too careful. Someone took him from us." Mason's mother, 81 and in failing health, lived long enough to see her son's killer arrested. She died 2 weeks later, her family said, finally at peace. The trial was set for March 2025, but Richard Chase, Felix Raven, Carlos Mendoza, the man of 3 names and countless lies, would never face a jury. On December 3, 2024, he was found dead in his federal holding cell. The autopsy revealed advanced pancreatic cancer, undiagnosed and untreated. He'd been dying for months, perhaps explaining his lack of resistance during arrest. In his cell, investigators found a handwritten letter addressed to the families. "I cannot undo what I've done," the letter read. "I cannot return your loved ones or ease your pain. I can only offer truth and the knowledge that I've lived in my own prison for 31 years. Every morning I saw their faces. Every night I heard that river. There is no forgiveness for what I've done, and I don't seek it. I only hope my confession brings you the closure I've never had." The revelation of Felix Raven's true identity as Carlos Mendoza sent shockwaves through multiple federal agencies. The Department of Justice launched an internal investigation into how a protected witness had been allowed to commit murder while under government supervision. The case files, sealed since 1989, revealed a pattern of oversight failures that had enabled a killer to hide in plain sight for over 3 decades. The complete audio restoration from the cassette recorder, finished in late November 2024, provided the crucial final pieces. Using advanced AI technology, FBI technicians recovered fragments previously thought lost to water damage. At 2:15 p.m. on July 15, 1993, Mason's voice emerged clearly. "I know who you are. I remember your face from the detention center. You're Carlos Mendoza." The silence that followed lasted 17 seconds, then Felix's voice, cold and resigned. "Then you know what has to happen." What followed was not the violent struggle investigators had imagined, but something more calculated. Felix had convinced them to move away from the main river channel, claiming he wanted to explain, to make them understand. "Let me show you the books," his voice said on the tape. "You'll see, it's not what you think." The naive trust in Theo's response was heartbreaking. "Okay, but we're still reporting this, Felix. It's the right thing to do." The forensic analysis of the life jackets revealed additional evidence. Along with the CO2 cartridge sabotage, investigators found traces of sedative on the inside collar, a powerful veterinary tranquilizer that would absorb through skin contact. Felix had planned multiple fail-safes. If the confrontation hadn't occurred, the sedative would have incapacitated them in the water, ensuring drowning even if the jackets had somehow functioned. The premeditation was more extensive than initially believed. Digital archaeologists examining Felix's past uncovered his activities during the missing years between 2003 and 2019. He'd assumed at least 2 more identities. Marcus Stone, a hunting guide in Alaska from 2003-2008, and David Winter, a maritime worker in Seattle from 2009-2018. Each identity was professionally crafted, complete with employment histories, tax records, and Social Security numbers. Someone with significant resources had helped Carlos Mendoza disappear repeatedly. The investigation revealed that Agent Marcus Webb's corruption ran deeper than suspected. Bank records from offshore accounts showed regular deposits from 1992 to 2010, totaling over $3 million. The money trail led to a disturbing conclusion. Webb had been selling protected witness information to the highest bidder, sometimes to the very cartels the witnesses had testified against. Felix had been both beneficiary and victim of this corruption, paying for new identities while living in constant fear of exposure. In December 2024, investigators located another crucial witness. James Fletcher, now 73, had worked as a federal prosecutor in the trials where Carlos Mendoza testified. "Mendoza was our star witness," Fletcher recalled. "He gave us names, routes, murder methods. His testimony put away 17 high-ranking cartel members. But he was also terrifying. Even in protective custody, other witnesses were afraid of him. He had this stillness, like a predator waiting." Fletcher revealed something that had been classified for decades. In 1991, while in witness protection, Carlos Mendoza had been suspected of killing another protected witness in Nebraska. The death had been ruled a suicide, but investigators had doubts. The victim had been about to recant testimony that Mendoza had corroborated. His death kept several convictions intact. "We could never prove anything, but after that, Mendoza was relocated to Montana, far from other protected witnesses." The pattern was clear. The government had knowingly placed a dangerous individual in an unsuspecting community, prioritizing successful prosecutions over public safety. When that individual began committing crimes, oversight failed at every level. Agent Webb had seen opportunity instead of obligation, monetizing his position while enabling continued criminal behavior. The system designed to protect had instead created perfect conditions for predation. Theo Blackwood's personal effects, returned to his family after 3 decades in evidence storage, contained a detail nobody had understood until now. In his wallet was a business card for a private investigator in Bozeman, Montana. The investigator, long retired, remembered the call. Young man, very earnest, wanted someone to look into a co-worker's background. Said something felt off, but he wanted proof before making accusations. I told him it would take a few weeks. He said he'd call back. He never did. The date of that call was July 12, 1993, 3 days before his death. Theo had been gathering evidence, planning a proper investigation. His methodical nature, the very quality that made him excellent at his job, had signed his death warrant. If he'd acted on instinct, reported suspicions immediately, he might have survived. Instead, his desire for fairness and proof had given Felix time to prepare. Mason River's military intuition had been more accurate than even he realized. Found in his apartment after the murders was a notebook where he'd been trying to place Felix's face. He'd drawn sketches, written lists of operations, tried to pinpoint the memory. One entry, dated July 14th, read, Panama, December 89, Detention Center 3. Processing intake. Young Sicario, maybe 20. Same eyes. Can't be coincidence. He'd been 1 day away from making the connection that would have exposed everything. The tourist photographs discovered in 2024 underwent extensive enhancement. While the figures remained too distant for facial identification, body language analysis revealed crucial details. At 2:30 p.m., the 2 seated figures showed relaxed postures, suggesting no awareness of immediate danger. The standing figure held what experts identified as a river guide's pole, but the grip and stance suggested potential use as a weapon. This was 15 minutes after Mason's recorded recognition of Felix's identity. Further investigation into the July 15, 1993 timeline revealed Felix had made a crucial mistake. Phone records showed he'd called someone from a payphone in Gardner at 4:45 p.m. before reporting the accident. The number led to a disconnected line previously registered to a federal office in Billings. He'd been seeking instructions, confirming his next moves with his handler. This call proved he'd been in contact with Webb throughout the crisis, not the traumatized survivor he'd pretended to be. The discovery of the bodies became a priority for the families. Felix's confession, while lacking graphic details, provided enough information for search teams to narrow their focus. In January 2025, using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, searchers located remains in a cave system adjacent to the Yellowstone River, 2 miles downstream from hell-roaring rapids. The location had been submerged in 1993, but exposed by decades of erosion and the 2024 drought. The identification process was respectful but thorough. DNA confirmed the remains as Theodore Blackwood and Mason Rivers. Both families finally had their loved ones returned for proper burial. The condition of the remains confirmed Felix's account. Quick deaths, not the prolonged agony of drowning the fake narrative had suggested. It was small comfort, but comfort nonetheless. They hadn't suffered. They'd simply been eliminated by someone protecting his secrets. Sarah Blackwood, Theo's sister, organized the memorial service. Hundreds attended, former colleagues, clients whose lives Theo had touched, strangers moved by the story. "My brother died because he was honest," Sarah said at the service. "He saw something wrong and tried to fix it. That integrity cost him his life, but it also eventually revealed the truth. Theo would have thought that was worth it." Mason's military brothers attended his funeral in full-dress uniform. His commanding officer from Panama, now a retired general, delivered the eulogy. Rivers had instincts that saved lives in combat. Those same instincts detected a threat in civilian life. He died as he lived, protecting others from dangers they didn't even know existed. The flag from his coffin was presented to his mother's sister, his closest surviving relative. Luna Morrison Harrison established a scholarship fund in both men's names, supporting young people entering outdoor recreation careers. "I can't change my silence in 1993, she said at the fund's announcement, "but I can ensure their legacy lives on through others who share their passion for the rivers and wilderness they loved." The fund's first recipient was a young woman from the Crow Reservation pursuing a degree in environmental science. The federal investigation's final report, released in March 2025, was damning. It documented systemic failures in the witness protection program, corruption that had enabled multiple crimes, and a culture that prioritized successful prosecutions over public safety. 17 officials faced disciplinary action, though most had already retired. New protocols were implemented, including mandatory psychological evaluations for all protected witnesses and increased oversight of handlers. The report revealed that Carlos Mendoza wasn't the only protected witness who'd committed crimes while in the program. Webb had managed 12 witnesses who'd disappeared under suspicious circumstances. At least 3 had been linked to unsolved murders in their placement communities. The program, designed to protect society from organized crime, had instead dispersed dangerous individuals throughout unsuspecting communities. Carter Sterling's role remained controversial even after the investigation concluded. Evidence suggested he'd suspected the equipment fraud, but chose profitable ignorance over investigation. His widow, interviewed in 2025, admitted, "Carter always said Felix was too good to be true. No family, no history, willing to work for nothing initially. But good help was hard to find, and Felix never caused visible problems." The rafting industry in Gardner instituted mandatory comprehensive background checks after the case's resolution. The cassette recorder that had survived 31 years underwater became a powerful symbol. The Smithsonian requested it for their collection on American crime and justice. Before donation, Theo's sister played the complete restored audio once. Hearing his voice again, so young and alive, planning for a future he'd never see, it broke my heart and healed it simultaneously. He's gone, but his truth survived. The place where the canoe was discovered became an unofficial memorial. Rafters and kayakers began leaving small stones in a cairn, each one representing a prayer for the victims or a promise to live with the integrity Theo had demonstrated. By summer 2025, the cairn had grown to impressive size, a testament to how the story had resonated beyond Montana. Felix Raven's death in custody prevented a trial, denying some the closure they sought. But investigators found one final piece of evidence in his cell after his death. He'd been writing a complete account of his life, from his childhood in Mexico through his cartel years, his time as Felix, and beyond. The manuscript ran 400 pages, a detailed confession that included 19 murders across his various identities. The 19th murder was a revelation. In 2001, Agent Marcus Webb had tried to extort Felix for more money, threatening to expose his location to the cartel. Felix had killed Webb's intermediary, a corrupt FBI accountant named Patricia Coleman, whose death had been ruled a robbery gone wrong. Felix wrote, "I became the monster they'd created, using the skills they'd valued to protect myself from their greed." The Coleman case was officially closed, bringing peace to another family. The manuscript revealed Felix's psychological state in his final years. "Every identity was a prison. Every face in every crowd could be someone who knew me before. I existed, but never lived. The Yellowstone took Theo and Mason's lives in minutes. It took mine across 3 decades, one day at a time." His insights into life in witness protection sparked congressional hearings on program reform. In the end, the numbers told only part of the story. 2 men murdered. 1 killer protected by the system meant to deliver justice. 31 years of lies. 3 identities, possibly more. 19 confirmed victims across 40 years. But the human cost transcended statistics. Families destroyed, trust betrayed, a community's innocence shattered. The Yellowstone River continued flowing, indifferent to human tragedy, its waters carrying new rafters through the same rapids where truth had been buried so long ago. The lasting impact came through institutional change. The Blackwood Rivers Act, passed in 2025, mandated psychological evaluation and monitoring for all protected witnesses, established victim notification protocols when protected witnesses were placed in communities, and created oversight mechanisms to prevent handler corruption. The act couldn't resurrect the dead, but it might prevent future tragedies. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a criminologist who studied the case, observed, "This wasn't just about one bad actor. It was systemic failure at every level. Carlos Mendoza was a killer, but the system enabled him, protected him, and ultimately failed to control him. Theo and Mason died because bureaucracy valued convictions over community safety. Their deaths exposed a rot that had festered for decades." The final memorial came from an unexpected source. The Montana State Legislature designated a section of the Yellowstone River as the Blackwood Rivers Wildlife Preserve, protecting it from development. The dedication plaque read, "In memory of Theodore Blackwood and Mason Rivers, who loved this river and died seeking truth. May these waters run free and clear, as honest as the men who gave their lives beside them." As 2025 drew to a close, the case that had begun with a drought-exposed canoe reached its conclusion. Not in a courtroom, but in the slow work of justice through revelation, reform, and remembrance. The Yellowstone River had finally given up its secrets, proving that time and nature could preserve truth even when humanity tried to bury it. The water that had hidden evidence for 31 years had ultimately delivered justice, patient and inevitable as the river itself. Sarah Blackwood stood at the memorial on the first anniversary of the discovery, August 2025. The river ran higher than the previous year, the drought having broken. Where the canoe had been found was again underwater, nature reclaiming the crime scene. "Theo always said the river never lies," she reflected. "It might hide things for a while, but eventually everything surfaces. He was right about that, like he was right about so many things. My brother's integrity killed him, but it also ensured his killer could never truly escape." The investigation officially closed on September 1, 2025. 13 months after a kayaker spotted a faded red canoe, justice had been served through truth rather than trial. Carlos Mendoza, Felix Raven, Richard Chase, the man of many names, had died taking his secrets to the grave, but not before the river had given up enough truth to honor the memories of two good men who'd had the misfortune of looking too closely at the wrong person's lies. In the end, the Yellowstone River mystery wasn't about the water at all. It was about the depths to which humans would sink to protect themselves, the heights of courage shown by those who sought truth, and the long arc of justice that bent slowly but inevitably toward revelation. The river flowed on, carrying new stories, but never forgetting the ones it had held for 3 decades in its cold, patient embrace.